Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Identity Insights by DCO. Today, I'm joined by Vadim Slavin, who's the Senior Director of Technology Evangelism at GlobaliD, to discuss some of the interesting technologies they're working on. Thanks so much for making some time for me today, Vadim. Is there anything else you'd like us to know about yourself?
Yeah, hi Tim. Thank you so much for having me. Of course. Let's see. You already mentioned I'm a Senior Director of Technology Evangelism. Still trying to figure out what that new title really means. But I like talking about self-sovereign identity. I like talking about digital identity. I'm really excited about all the things that we're doing at GlobaliD. So I guess I'm a good fit for that role. There's a lot of interesting topics we can discuss today. So I'm looking forward to engage with your audience and maybe provide some insight into the state of the art in digital identity out there, what different terms mean, and specifically what we're doing at GlobaliD to address those challenges of digital identity. So thanks again for having me.
Awesome. No, we appreciate it. So let's start with some background on GlobaliD. What challenges or problems did you guys set out to solve?
Yeah, so we are very strong believers in self-sovereign identity. We believe that your identity is your permission to act. We believe that where the trends are going, digital identity is going to be very important. And more importantly, it's the authority over your own data that's going to become very important with the advent of Web3. And so that is a big problem today. Everybody knows that this is important, but there isn't really a lot of solutions out there for self-sovereign identity that consumers are embracing today. There are some limitations to what you can do with it. There are some challenges with having your identity only on one device. What happens if you lose it? People are concerned with that. And also, if there's something that you can use only once a month, are you that inclined to download that solution and really embrace it? So at GlobaliD, we're working on solving that problem.
All right, interesting. So, sorry, just taking a step back. Obviously, you mentioned Web3 there. Could you define kind of what that means to the average person, right?
Yeah, so Web3 implies the existence of Web1, Web2, and somebody that's been in the industry for as long as I have, not necessarily to date myself, but Web1 is where we all started. This was very static pages out there. There was, the very early days of Yahoo, which was just a list of different links. AOL was an example of Web1. This is where we came from, right? There's this one central authority that would control access to information. And then about 10, 15 years ago, we started seeing new ideas around social media, new ideas around updating centralized sources so that we really distribute authority over content. So social media accounts, Wikipedia is another example of Web2. All of a sudden, you can crowdsource information and start changing what the website looks like. And Web3 is kind of the next frontier. We're only seeing a glimpse of that. This is where users take control over their data. Users really own the data and the information they put out in that world. So you can draw parallels between Web1, Web2, Web3 in terms of information domain, but also in terms of identity, what it means to have an identity in the Web2 world versus Web3. In Web2, we are kind of slaves to the centralized authorities that create accounts for us in each one of those silos. So I have a separate account on Facebook, I have a separate account on Twitter and LinkedIn. Web3 means that I take ownership of those accounts. They're really mine. I don't have to ask permission to export my reputation, my digital clout, if you will, because it should be owned by me. And Web3 means that every one of us will have control over our own self-sovereign identity.
All right. And just to break down that term real quick, the self-sovereign identity, that's where you hold all the data, correct? Like it's all yours.
That's where, yeah, my data is my data. I get to say who gets to see it, because it's based on my own permission to share it with somebody. Today, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that there are big companies out there that sell and resell our data for the benefit of those companies. We don't really see any value from that aside from maybe more targeted ad campaigns. But our data is out there. Our social securities are out there, and that makes us vulnerable. So is there a way for us to move into the Web3 world by taking ownership of that data and really deciding who gets to see it and who doesn't get to see it?
Okay.
That's what it's all about.
And so what is GlobaliD's answer then? How do you take control of that data with GlobaliD?
Yeah, so GlobaliD is building on top of the self-sovereign identity stack. There are technologies out there that are becoming more and more standardized. We're not completely there, but there are some emerging technology stacks that different companies are starting to use. And the problem is that how do you make it usable? How do you make it, first of all, available to everybody? Available not only to those that know the difference between Web3 and Web2, but really anybody out there that needs access to civil services, for example, right? Somebody that doesn't necessarily know the difference between different apps. How do you make it available to everybody? And the other thing is, once you find a need for self-sovereign identity, once you go through that first application of what different service you may be interacting with requires, how do you stick with it? How do you find it useful beyond that first application? Is there an ecosystem of service providers out there that are willing to accept that self-sovereign identity? Because the power of self-sovereign identity is its usability and portability. Once you verify your identity once you build that reputation in your identity, you can reuse it very, very easily. So it's growing the ecosystem of those partners that are able to take advantage of self-sovereign identity of consumers. It's also finding a way to let consumers find new ways to interact with each other based on trustworthy digital identity. All of those ideas is what we're incorporating into our GlobaliD ecosystem, and we're well on our way to make that happen.
All right, that sounds super exciting. Are there any platforms that you're currently integrated with? Like if I had a GlobaliD identity, where could I use it today, for example?
Well, I would invite you to download GlobaliD and find out for yourself. Yes, there are regulated compliant entities out there that rely on GlobaliD. There's also different digital services out there that choose to use GlobaliD to reduce the pressure of automated bot attacks. There are a lot of interesting use cases that we're exploring right now with our existing and new customers.
All right. So once I have my ID, right, it's stored on my phone, correct? That's where the credential.
It is.
All right. So what happens if I lose or damage my phone? Is there a backup? Is there a biometric or anything?
Yes. I think you're alluding to the fact that self-sovereign identity's power is in the fact that it's in one place. So it's really hard for somebody to take over your identity. And part of the reason why that is so is because, yes, you keep it on your phone, the device that you keep near and dear to your heart most than anything else in your life these days is my guess. And that means that, yeah, what happens if you lose your phone? How can you prove that you are who you say you are? And how do you take over your own identity? How do you prove that that actually belongs to you? So at GlobaliD, we obviously have very straightforward ways to do that. If you are very diligent about recording your private key, your password, it's very easy to restore your identity. There are different ways to do that, of course, on our platform. But perhaps the simpler and more interesting way of doing that is by designating trustees. It's the people that you know, that know you, that will hold part of the key of your identity. The basic premise here is that if you lose your identity, if you want to reconstitute your identity on another device, it would be a lot harder for somebody to convince your close network, be a family, your significant other, it could be your lawyer for that matter, that it's actually that they're trying to impersonate you, right? So if it is really you can just call those folks up, you can send that request, and you should have no problem convincing 3 of your closest allies, trustees, that you really need help. Whereas if there's somebody else trying to do that on your behalf, it would be a lot harder. So it's always finding that balance between security and simplicity, and different companies solve it in different ways. You provide simplicity at the expense of security. And yeah, that's what helps adoption of these tools. But at the same time, at GlobaliD, we take security of your identity very, very seriously. So we want to offer a lot of different tools out there for you, the consumer, the owner of your identity, to decide what is best for you.
All right. That sounds super interesting. So going back to what you said, right, splitting my identity among some friends or trusted advisors, allies. How would that work? How many could I choose potentially, right? You said I would need 3 to get in. Could I set like 20 of them up and just, hey, what if Chuck's busy kind of thing, right? If there's only 3, then there's also could be a barrier of I can't get a hold of him, so I can't get back.
Of course. Yes, we're experimenting with this feature. It's live today. You can check it out. The very first version is that you can designate several different trustees, so that only a subset of those trustees are required to reconstitute your key. Yes, absolutely. That's a very good use case.
All right, sounds good. So yeah, what exciting projects is GlobaliD working on that you could talk about right now, kind of building off that? What are your next, goals for the rest of the year or maybe next year?
Yeah, so we're looking for the biggest pain points with respect to different other digital services where they would like to apply a solution like GlobaliD. So some of the things that come to mind is we're working with the credit union ecosystem right now to enable a credential that will simplify account opening for those that are outside of the traditional financial system today, where there's a barrier because a traditional government photo ID is required. So self-sovereign identity, the way that we're implementing it at GlobaliD, makes it easier for somebody to verify that they are who they say they are without the use of a government ID. So that's one effort. Another effort is proof of personhood, for example, in order to, which is a little bit more complicated than proof of liveness. Not only do you have to prove that you are a live, real person, it's also about proving that there isn't, 100 different identities that you control. Applications such as airdrops, applications such as financial services out there find this incredibly helpful. In fact, U.S. Congress is actually paying a lot of attention to automated services and bots. We've seen this in the news, what's happening with Twitter. People are really concerned that these automated bots are a big obstacle to true democracy out there. So there's a new bill that is being sponsored in Congress. It's called Bot Research Act, that is trying to look closer at the implications of bots and automated accounts on our social media and even elections to a great extent. We're also looking at problems in the compliance space, specifically the famed travel rule compliance. For those that don't know, it's the requirement that identity information travels along the financial transaction. It's a regulatory obligation by regulatory bodies out there in the world. What happens when that rule has to apply to a transaction with a non-custodial wallet, where there isn't a centralized entity that is able to provide verified KYC information? So we're also looking at applications of self-sovereign identity to problems like that. In fact, we've put together a potential solution for travel rule compliance for non-custodial wallets. We call it the private framework. It's a combination of security features and privacy preserving features that will enable compliance with travel rule for those centralized entities that are dealing with non-custodial wallets. I know it's a whole other topic, but for those of you that perked up when I mentioned travel rule compliance and non-custodial wallets, I invite you to check out privateframework.org to check out what we put together. And we're always looking for partners to help us implement some of the solutions that we envision.
All right, very cool. So you touched on a lot of information there. That was awesome. One thing in particular that I perked up to was right? Challenging all the Twitter bots and, the multiple accounts that a lot of people can just open on all these, social medias, Facebook, Twitter, all that. What is stopping you, right? If I have a GlobaliD identity, can I not create a new one? And what kind of, if there are any, what
Absolutely.
stops you from doing that?
That's a great question. You deserve different identities depending on your circle, depending on your environment, right? You're a different person to your employee, to your employer. You're a different person in your social network. You're a different person with your club, sports club, whatever that may be. And of course, because we have different identities, we deserve different digital identities that don't really, that cannot be tied together. This speaks to the privacy of those identities. But you should not be able to control hundreds of these identities, because that means that you're probably instigating some kind of what's called a Sybil attack. I know it's an industry term. It basically means that one person pretending to be many different people. And this is what these bots are after. They're trying to influence public opinion. They're trying to maybe comment on a specific topic, trying to amplify that particular topic for its own nefarious reasons. So where's that balance? How many identities should you have? Well, at GlobaliD, we believe it should only be a few. It should not be too many. And there are tools within our platform that carefully make sure that that is the case, where you can create several, but not too many different digital identities.
All right, that makes sense. I don't know if you can tell me, but is there like a hard limit on that? Like if you find out, oh, Tim has 7, that's enough, cut him off, or is?
I believe it's 5. I believe it's 5 today. We're still exploring different tools to either do a hard cutoff or maybe provide some kind of economic incentive for you to keep your number of identities to some sort of a limit. We're still exploring that. We're looking for feedback from our users, from consumers, like all of us. Everybody has different opinions, and honestly, there isn't a specific answer that I expect. I think it's going to depend on what people choose to do. And again, freedom is the power. So maybe if you're willing to pay for 50 identities, maybe that's okay. Just know that it's going to be really, really expensive for you to pretend to be somebody bad. But if you have a legitimate reason for it, maybe that's the way to go.
Okay, sounds good. Well, it looks like that is about our time. Thank you so much for joining me again today, Vadim. If you want to learn a little bit more about GlobaliD, I'll have a link to their website below in the description. And if you're interested in learning more about self-sovereign identity in general, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel, as we'll continue to bring you some more educational content. If you have any questions or specific topics that you'd like for us to cover, please leave a comment below and we'll be sure to address them. And yeah, thanks again, Vadim. Is there anything else that you'd like to plug before we go?
Yeah, travel rule solution is something that's on top of my mind today. I just recently went to a conference where that's literally the first conversation that we had. So people are thinking about that. Web3, distributed finance, cryptocurrency, all of those things are on top of people's minds. And we have put together that private framework. Private is an acronym. It's a clever one, if I may say so. So check it out, privateframework.org, and see what you guys think. Looking forward to your feedback.